Welcome, Catrina and Francis.
Good morning.
Thank
Good
you.
morning. I'm just going to give you a slight bio. I can't touch on everything in your careers, but let me just, for those who aren't as familiar with you as they will be at the end of our conversation, let me just say that Catrina Tapley was appointed Deputy Minister of Immigration, Refugees and Citizenship Canada in August 2019. Prior to that, she was the Deputy Secretary to the Cabinet for Operations in the Privy Council Office. And before joining PCO, Ms. Tapley served at Immigration, Refugees and Citizenship Canada from 2010 to 2016, a Senior Assistant Deputy Minister for Strategic and Program Policy and as Associate Assistant Deputy Minister. And she's also held positions at the Treasury Board of Canada and served in executive jobs at Human Resources and Skills Development Canada and at Fisheries and Oceans Canada. So she comes to this discussion very well prepared. Francis McGuire assumed his current position as president of the Atlantic Canada Opportunities Agency, ACOA, in June 2017. Prior to that, he served as president and CEO of Major Drilling Group International, Inc. from 2000 to 2015, a very long run, and after which he provided advice to companies and individuals on strategy, leadership, and organizational design until assuming the reins at ACOA. In the 1980s and 1990s, Francis McGuire worked in Premier Frank McKenna's government as Deputy Minister of Economic Development and Tourism and as leader of the province's Information Highway Secretariat, as we all called it back then. So, as I say, welcome to both of you, and I'm looking forward to the conversation this morning. Let's start with where we find ourselves today. How do you expect I'll go to each of you in turn, starting maybe with you, Francis. How do each of you expect the progress on the Atlantic Growth Strategy, and particularly its immigration thrusts, to be impacted by the COVID-19 crisis? What has changed and what hasn't changed? Francis?
So what hasn't changed is the demographics. We're still going to lose 220,000 people out of the labor force in the next 10 years. And something might be moved a little bit to the right, but that just doesn't go away. Maybe people stay a little bit longer. It's interesting if you disaggregate that to understand the short term. The latest job forecast that was done before COVID, so it's obviously changed a bit, said that they had 86,000 jobs to be filled this year in Atlantic Canada. 40% of those were going to be require high school or less. 40% were going to require a technical trade or degree, et cetera, and 20% were going to require university educations. When you look at these separately, you get different pictures. Particularly when you get to that 40% technical side, I don't forecast any slowdown. So you're looking at things like truck drivers, forestry workers, ICT workers, health workers, et cetera. Those parts of our economy today are going very well. They're the type of jobs that people in Atlantic Canada either don't want or not qualified for. And employers are going to keep on driving that. Now, I would suspect that on the non-qualified, so those jobs not requiring high schools, that you will see a shortage, less in the coffee shops, less in the hotels. So that's probably going to slow down for a while. But those, nevertheless, with time, are going to come back, and will. So next year, maybe a year and a half or 6 months, but that demand will come back too, because those jobs have to be filled. And on the university side, it's the same thing. Now, is there a mismatch between our graduates and like, yes, we need more engineers, we need more ICT people. And when you need them today, you just can't wait 4 or 5 years for these people to graduate. So that will continue. So last year we had just over 15,000 immigrants. Given that the 40% is going to be fairly strong, and I don't expect any change, and I don't see any change with the employers we work with, that you might see in 2020 half that number come through, just because, particularly on the those areas that don't require high school education, a slowing and some caution. Obviously, tourism is very slow. Coffee shops have been slower, and so if you disaggregate it, you see one element that's going to be as active as it was last year, and the economy needs those people just as much as it always did. And then but 2021, you'll see the other two categories, I think, pick up. So those are what I think we're looking at.
Okay, well, thank you for that. Catrina, for you, what has changed and what hasn't changed?
So what hasn't changed, and I'll agree with Francis on this one, what hasn't changed are the demographics. And so because of COVID, we didn't suddenly have a baby boom, or maybe not yet. Although there was this Facebook meme that said, if there's a baby boom, the prediction will be, it will be only of firstborn children. Like, I'll just let you think about that. But so the reliance on immigration for labor force growth, the reliance on immigration to offset Canada's demographics, that hasn't changed. So what has changed is the relative unemployment rate in the country. My friend Graham Flack would say, we've gone from the best labor market in Canadian history to the worst labor market in Canadian history in less than 2 months. So that's been a big change. Where most of the job losses have been felt are in lower wage occupations, in the service sector, in lower wage occupations. So again, what didn't change, we didn't magically create a bunch of new software engineers. Though those things for permanent immigration are really important, and I think will continue to be really important. What I think we're going to have to do from an immigration perspective is look pretty carefully at certain sectors and where immigration is helpful in terms of supporting economic growth. I think it's going to make us look a little differently. What we focused on for a long time is kind of a high skills model of permanent immigration, higher human capital, the best and the brightest. And I think we may have to put another overlay on that, and that's meeting regional labor market needs. And I think we've started to do some of that, but I think it's going to be even more important as we look at levels planning as we go forward. So the government announced early in March its levels plan for 2020. We have a requirement to be back in Parliament by November with the immigration levels plan for 2021 by November 1st. And so we'll see where the government wants to adjust and what it wants to look at. For now, the government's commitment is to 1 million permanent immigrants to Canada over 3 years, and that hasn't changed. Spoiler alert, we may not make our levels plan for this year, given events in the world, given travel restrictions that are still there, other issues in host countries as well, and in sending countries. And so we'll have to see how we adjust over the next 3 years in terms of meeting our targets and meeting those needs.
And do you expect the flow of immigrants to begin again in the late fall?
The quick answer, I think, would be yes, and it'll depend on a whole bunch of factors. But one is we've never shut down business. And so we've continued to process applications. What the government agreed in terms of travel restrictions is that anybody's permanent residence application who had been approved before March 18th was still eligible to travel through this period and could still arrive. We have a number of people who are already in Canada, either as temporary foreign workers or students who will, in our vernacular, will land this year. And so by September, we may see things pick up, but that will depend on a number of factors. It'll depend on how things are in host countries as well, whether or not people can vacate their apartment, whether they can deal with their family affairs, whether they can get themselves to Canada. We'll see, but yeah, we sure do expect it to pick up by the fall.
Okay, so before all this happened, what were you seeing from the Atlantic immigration pilot? Is there evidence that skills gaps were narrowing? Was the labor market truly evolving? Catrina, I'll start with you, and then I would like Francis, to weigh in on that, and particularly from a business point of view as well for Francis.
Let me start. Oh,
yeah, let me just start with Catrina on what we were seeing.
So what we saw with the Atlantic pilot over the couple of years since its inception was about 6,200 people come to Atlantic Canada through the pilot. So these are skilled immigrants. It's a great pilot in terms of how it combines employer needs, but both employer support and community support to make a welcoming environment. And just for people who aren't familiar with it, one of the things that we tried to do with this pilot was to deal with the question of retention. And so people were coming to the Atlantic region under the provincial nominee program, but in many cases weren't staying and were leaving for other parts of Canada. So what we wanted to focus on in Atlantic Canada and work in Atlantic Canada was how to retain immigrants, how to create a welcoming community, but also create that link between the employer and what was happening. So we did an evaluation after the first year, and we saw really positive results. We saw retention rates that were in the 90s, and that was so from our perspective, we have initial results that are really successful around this program.
So, Francis, same question to you. As I say, perhaps from an employer point of view, to some extent, were our employers having an easier time matching the skills that they need, given that the Atlantic Pilot project has been in place for several years now?
So yes, and you have to understand that for our employers that have never been in the immigration business before, have never understood the rules, how you go about it, that there was a very, very sharp learning curve. And so it took at least a year, and I would say when I look at our clients, about a third of them really understand it and are very supportive, and the other 2/3 are coming along and need to learn. So it is a voyage, and that's continuing. But in terms of the labor market, you know, there's 15,000 immigrants that came, but there's only in there about 7,000 workers because there's families and others, which is exactly what we want, because that gives that stickiness, particularly if you keep care of the spouse. But if you come back to, we need 20,000 people a year. If we can get 8 or 10,000 from immigration, that's great, but it still leaves a gap. And so this is a part of labor market, and employers, the way they act, see that. They are modernizing, they're trying to automate, they're trying to do all those things while they're bringing in new workers, while they're trying to bring in young people, etc. So from an employer's point of view, this is a piece of the puzzle that they've had to learn, just like in automation too. I'd say most of our companies just didn't know how to digitize and automate. And so there's a huge cultural change occurring. And as Catrina pointed out, in what's special about the pilot is that employers have to show how they're going to work on retention. And we keep on saying that you may not have understood that you're in the retention business, but guess what? That's a new business skill that you have to adopt. You have to keep care that you can't have a spouse stay at home locked in an apartment and expect somebody to stay here. You've got to integrate those people, maybe find them a job, but certainly integrate the spouse and the family, get the kids play soccer. If you don't do that as an employer, not a social agency, not somebody, you as an employer need to take that responsibility. That's probably the biggest change in mentalities that the pilot brought. And it's, for a lot of employers, it's successful. A lot of our employers still have to learn.
So when you use the term cultural change for how employers have had to learn their way up this curve you described, it also seems that this has happened in the context of a larger cultural change, one that was at one point, I think, more resistant to immigration and saw immigration as competition for jobs. And I think those attitudes have changed very markedly over recent years. But I'm wondering what you think happens now, as labor markets won't be as tight as they are. As Catrina's told us, we've gone from the tightest labor markets to the highest levels of unemployment in an instant, and particularly youth unemployment, which is very, very high. Do you think that there might be some backsliding on the cultural change we've seen?
So personally, there is a danger. I don't think you'll see much of that because, again, what really broke the back of public opinion is what happened in our elder care homes. When people realize that my grandmother is stuck or my mother is stuck in a hospital bed and I can't put her in a old age home. There's a bed there, there's a room, but there's nobody to change the sheets, nobody to do the cleaning. When people understood that, it became very, very personal. I don't think people cared that much about the fish plant employer that can't get his processing done, but that came later. So I think, yes, there's been a real change. The danger, though, I think that worries us at ACOA is really, if there's a chance for a backlash, it will happen with youth. The youth always get hit hardest in a recession. They're the last in, the first out. Some of the entry-level positions in tourism, et cetera, are gone and will be slower coming back. And so I think in Atlantic Canada, at least, but probably Canada, that the immigration policy has to be paralleled with a much stronger youth employment thrust. And so that will become the demographic challenge. Those will be two really important poles that have to work together.
Well, let's stick with that for a second, but let me just, for the sake of the audience, let me just cite a couple of figures to what you're saying. We will get a labor market force survey this week on Friday. It will be the third since the coronavirus crisis started. The last one in May told us that from February to April, employment among youth declined by 34.2%. And on top of that, an additional 1 in 4 who remained officially employed lost all or the majority of their usual hours. So we're talking quite a devastation there. Catrina, how do you expect as well this to play out on what has been, you know, a real growth in positive attitudes that immigration leads to economic growth and not to competition for jobs?
A really good question. And to maybe state the obvious, we're really sensitive to public opinion with respect to immigration. It's our social license on our immigration levels and what we want to do. And I'll come back to where Francis was. And what was interesting, when we saw a bit of a backlash in New Brunswick over temporary foreign workers and fish plant workers who were coming in, and the Premier made some fairly strong statements initially, we saw some polling shortly after that, and we really worried about the hit that was going to take on people's attitudes towards immigration. And what we saw was there was a strong hit to people's attitudes toward immigration, particularly on the temporary side. But what we didn't see was from a permanent side, or people coming in terms of alleviating the things we talked about earlier, the demographic situation, net growth in the labor market, that people are more sophisticated, that they understood that there's a difference between those two things. And I think that's important for us in an immigration context as well, that there's a difference between permanent migration and what people expect out of a levels plan, and a difference between the temporary foreign worker side, which was something to be temporary, to fill jobs that Canadians didn't want to do. And I think we're going to have to be pretty deliberate in our thinking about those two things. The other thing I just mentioned is we're pretty concerned about immigrants themselves. So just as you've talked about what figures are on youth unemployment, immigrants get hit disproportionately hard by downturns as well. And so if we look at those same numbers you talked about from February to April 2020, recent immigrants got hit 23.2%, so a 23.2% loss of jobs under recent immigrants, and that's hard. There's a scarring effect that occurs with immigration as well. I think it occurs in other parts of the labor market, but particularly in immigration, where people who are coming into to a recession, we saw this in the 90s, we saw this in parts of the 2000s, where people are coming in and they're finding it more difficult to find a job. That scarring effect on how long it takes to catch up to the Canadian average is really exacerbated. So that wasn't quite your question. So I'll come back to your question, which was, what do we do around attitudes and how do we want to promote this? And I think it comes back to, governments have to pay attention to both sides of this question. So one is on reducing inequalities, protecting vulnerable sectors, promoting fairness and access to opportunities. Those are all a given. But from an immigration point of view, it comes back to us to double down on our efforts around Immigration Matters. And, it's a campaign that we've launched with some success. We could have more success at it. But the stories of how immigration has contributed to communities in Canada are really powerful. My favorite is the Charlottetown Figure Skating Club. And so, I encourage you, Google this. It is worth seeing, and if it doesn't put a lump in your throat, I don't know what does. But it talks about how the immigrant community in Charlottetown saved the figure skating club. And so it's really how immigration and immigrants become a net benefit to the community. And I think that's important.
Well, if there had been a Charlottetown skating club in 1929, and if my grandparents might have found it, I might be an islander, which would be great. Um, um, I'm interested actually, the comparison in some ways of younger people and their plight and immigrants, because, I suppose in some ways it's the same principle of last in, first out. And I'm wondering if we're going to have to do some, special programming around that, if that's something that either one of you were thinking about.
We definitely are. We think it's absolutely capital. It is. We put a lot. It's funny for an agency like ours. We work very, very closely with IRCC on this and working with the employers, et cetera. That was part of the secret, I think. But the same way that was important, because why would ACOA be involved in immigration originally? Well, because we understood that it's absolutely key to development. The same way with youth. So we absolutely need to, we're thinking through right now, all right, we've done quite a bit, but we haven't done enough. So what do we do next? And that has, like I said, it's a balance. We cannot do one without the other.
Okay. Before I'm going to move on to a couple of other questions, but I just want to remind the audience that that we're now accepting your questions, and these will come to me, and I will do my best to ask as many of them as I can. In the meantime, Francis, let me talk about something that you said at our first Atlantic Summit a couple of years back in Fredericton, where you are today. And you spoke about how you were seeing more and more employers turning heavily towards the application of capital, the application of AI, in part because this is the trend of the world, but in part because they were having trouble finding skilled workers. Is this something that that you expect to continue? I mean, obviously it will. It's a matter of how steep the curve is, I suppose. But is capital going to be competing more with labor?
So you're looking at our planning documents, obviously, because exactly, like you take that 20,000, we think automation's got to replace a third of those jobs. And then immigration's got to do a third, and then we have to find the other third with youth and indigenous, especially indigenous youth. So there's really three, and yes, we do. We've seen even through this COVID and the short-term adjustments the companies are coming through. We're surprised to see it really is. I'm looking to the future. I know that I have to have more space, therefore less people. How do I do that? I have to automate. And so it really is all three. But they fit together because we need these immigrants with those skills to come in. When I talked about ICT, when I talk about what we have to train our young people in these skills, how to work in automation, and to tell them that, I keep on saying the most advanced plant that we have is Neguac Beausoleil oysters in Neguac. And somebody would say, how can they be so into data, marketing, technology, et cetera? It's an oyster plant. But what I would call our traditional industries have to use all three poles. And these are interesting jobs. And the nice thing about it, we learn with the temporary workers, you're not going to get kids in New Brunswick to go work at a fish plant or pick blueberries. This is not going to happen. However, you can automate. And yes, you want to bring in these temporary workers, particularly because they are temporary. They're coming here to work for 6 months and then they go home. They don't go on EI. This is what we need. And they're very productive. And if we look at our agricultural industries, they are competing in a world market. They have to be productive. And so and I think to Catrina's point, first 2 weeks of, yes, I think everybody thought, yeah, why do we need? Because temporary workers are invisible. They work on a farm, they're out in the woods, etc. We don't see, unlike the other immigrants who live in our cities, go to our schools. And so I think a lot of people, particularly because the agricultural community and the fishing community has been so vocal, saying, yes, you have to understand this. But this is good. These are jobs that, by their nature, will never be 12 months a year. And if people can come in, help us be productive, make money, develop our economy, and then go home and take money back to their communities, everybody wins.
Right. let me turn to the audience question for a moment, and I think I'll try to direct this at you, Catrina. I hope it's not. I hope that's a nice thing that I'm doing. The question says, many Atlantic employers are taking on immigrant support themselves to retain them for their workforce. That type of extra activity is not possible for many SMEs and for not-for-profits, especially now. So what is the government doing to support them, or what should it be doing to get the workers they need? This is particularly the SMEs and the not-for-profits.
Well, maybe I'll disagree just slightly with the premise of the question. I don't think it is that difficult for SMEs and not-for-profits. And gee whiz, I'm trying to remember the name of Doug Robertson's group in Moncton that's doing a lot of venture capital work. And he was telling me, Ben, and he was telling me about the success they've had both using the Atlantic Immigration Pilot, but also using Express Entry, which is our flagship program to bring in skilled immigrants. And so I think the more we can simplify our processes, and one of the things that this crisis has taught us well is that radical simplification is not a bad thing. And so where do we come back to basics? How do we take that back, and how do we work with communities? And I'm not suggesting for a second we can't do better, we can. But I think in this region that SMEs and not-for-profits may have had some pretty good success with some of these programs.
Okay, let me
come back to this learning.
Francis, you want to weigh in on that?
Yeah, again, this is a lot easier, and it's a necessary business skill today, just like marketing is, or sales. And people have gone through the learning thing, and they start off absolutely petrified, and then learn it. Well, it's not all that bad once I start doing it. And once I've done it once, it's easy. So the thing holding back a lot of SMEs, and we go and visit them and take them through, is fear of starting. That's the number one issue. It's not the overall necessity or complexity.
Right. Okay. I have a question here that I'm going to embellish slightly because I'm quite interested in as well. It says economic immigration is important, but can you also talk about how refugees fit into the puzzle? What special supports do they need? There's a reference in the question to the 2016 Syrian resettlement, and I will just add to that. It'd be interesting to know what longitudinal work, to the extent that 4 years can be longitudinal, work that you have on how the 2016 resettlement has gone in terms of the labor market. Catrina, I'll start with you again, okay?
Okay, pop quiz on my stats on how integration has gone with respect to our Syrian refugee movement.
And at the same time, qualitatively, how refugees fit into the picture.
Yeah, all right, I'll do both. I'll start with the large cohort of Syrians that came in. They're doing well. They're not without challenges. We've done some evaluation work on this, so it's not without challenges, and challenges that I think you'd expect. We took a lot of tough cases from a refugee perspective, people that came in with low literacy skills in Arabic, never mind English. But some things, it underscored some things for us. Those who came in under the private sponsorship model did better than those who came in under the government sponsored model. And one of the reasons for that is under the government model, we will take tougher cases, higher needs, tougher cases, and tougher to integrate. For a private sponsor, there tends to be a family connection. There's a better wraparound of supports. And I'll come back to what Francis just said about the Atlantic Immigration Pilot. When you have that wraparound of supports for employers, when you've got government working better together at both levels, you get better results and better outcomes. So refugees overall, the government's commitment to refugees has not wavered. It's been very difficult during COVID. We have almost stopped, not quite, and that's because our key partners, the UN High Commission for Refugees and the International Organization for Migration, have pretty much stopped business. And it's very difficult to get people out of situations. It's very difficult to get people to Canada. And then there are higher needs when people get here. So we have to have our service provider organizations ready to stand up some pretty intensive quarantine around where people are coming from, and how it works. But having said that, we've still managed to settle about 100 urgent protection cases in the last 2 months. And we're anxious to get back to kind of a regular footprint when it comes to refugees and supporting refugees, and to be able to have those who are being privately sponsored land in Canada. So I'm confident that we'll get back to that in the fall. But it's more resource intensive. It requires more settlement support. It requires higher supports around upskilling, around language training, integration into the Canadian society, into basic things like how to shop in a grocery store in many cases. But it's a much tougher population. But I have to say it's pretty rewarding on the other side.
Okay, let me start wrapping on this question. And again, I go back to our first summit a couple of years back on this subject, and we put some real cases in front of the audience, and I was very impressed. There was a woman from St. John, a Russian Jewish immigrant from Israel to St. John, and St. John was being very creative in finding these people and bringing them in and retaining them and giving them a sense of community in the way you guys have spoken. I wonder if you're at this every day. Both of you, well, you both have lots of other responsibilities in it, but this is a big part of the portfolio. Are there any examples from employers, from communities, creative solutions that you've seen that you think other people in the region will want to know something about? You're nodding, Catrina, so you get to go first. And I don't know if Francis has one in his head, but I buy him a little bit of time.
All right. Yeah, I have to watch my body language. Yes, I was nodding. So we've had I think some really good success around work and settlement at the same time. And by that, I mean working with employers where we can set up language training in the workplace. And so employers, particularly in the service industry, where hotels are looking for chambermaids, they've been looking for other things, that these have been great entry-level jobs for a lot of refugees who have come in. And so we've worked with employers to be able to set up language training in the workplace. So you work for 9 hours, but 2 hours of those maybe working with a settlement agency at the workplace on that. So those have been really positive experiences. I can also talk about exporting our private sponsorship model, but maybe I'll park that and turn it over to Francis.
Well, my favorite one is, again, seeing the private sector mobilize. So Edmonton, New Brunswick had several hundred jobs that couldn't fill. They had to bring in some butchers from Belgium to work in their processing plant. And they realized very quickly that they happened to be all men, and they were bringing their spouses over. And they realized if we don't do something about the spouses, so the Chamber of Commerce became the employment agency, if you would, saying, okay, IGA, you've got 5 or 6 shifts a week. Can we bring one of these, happens to be women, in, so that, because getting that workplace could socialize, etc. And so the Chamber of Commerce took off, usually that's not what they do, said, we must keep care of the spouses. And so there's an example of business getting it and say, yeah, how do we actually keep care of those people?
All right, good. I'm going to go back to
happy life is universal.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, happy wife, happy life is universal.
Yeah.
Let me go back to the audience for a moment. There's a question that says, what are the panelists' thoughts on moving seasonal industries to year-round work through job sharing, partnerships between employers, etc., to try to get out of a seasonal work mentality and move to permanent immigration?
So the numbers just don't work. So there's a great example of a potato farmer up in Carleton County that employs people, they're all Canadian, by the way, for half the year, and then the maple syrup company next door hires them for the others. So that's work, but the numbers are small. When you look at the numbers you need in the fish plant, it just doesn't work. There isn't we don't have that kind of work in winter. We have a natural resource based industry, and it closes down. And then the skills are not the same. Like forestry workers, they work in big $600,000 forestry things, very technical, etc. But the fish plant worker just doesn't have that skill. So it sounds okay in theory. When you actually get down to the details, it doesn't work. Some jobs are just seasonal. That's how they'll always be. Lobster only gets caught in from spring to fall. It does, well, a little bit in Nova Scotia gets caught in winter, but it's kind of like that's not. It sounds great, but once you try to make the pieces work, it doesn't work.
I guess that would render the temporary foreign workers type of program as an ongoing, continuing. It's not it's temporary in terms of the stay in Canada, but as a program, it will have to be a more permanent program. That's right.
But there is, Catrina will talk about, there is a ladder from temporary, and a lot of people are using it. But Catrina, that's your area of expertise.
Catrina, are we seeing increasing use of that?
Yeah, absolutely. We're seeing increasing use, but not all temporary foreign workers are created equal. So there are different parts to the temporary foreign worker program. So one of the things that we've talked about for the agri-food industry is the seasonal agriculture worker program. And it works because it's just that, it's seasonal, and it's a seasonal industry. But we think there is room, and I agree with Francis, the numbers we don't think are huge in this area. So we have just launched something called the Agri-Food Pilot. And what the Agri-Food Pilot will look at is year-round jobs in the agri-food sector. And so bringing in temporary foreign workers for those jobs with the goal of having a path to permanency for those occupations. So a lot of these will be more greenhouse operated, mushroom growers, meat packing plants, where you do have a more reasonable expectation of year-round employment. But for those coming in under the traditional seasonal agricultural worker program, I would argue it works pretty well.
Well, I'm sorry, Francis.
There are some industrial changes. In the fish plants, for instance, many fish plants, because they're trying to attract Canadians, have tried to go to multi-species factories so that they can get not 20 weeks of work, but 40 weeks. It's not kind of 52, but at least 40. And in those cases, you do see the employers trying to take those workers that are temporary and move them into permanent. And we see some of that, but there's only so many plants that can move into longer term processing, having catching fish and processing fish and lobsters are mechanically extremely different. And so from an investment point of view, some are doing it, but so it works, but it's limited.
Right. Okay. Let me ask one last question from the audience here, and again, I will embellish it a little bit, and it does touch on the food, on agri-food that, as you were talking about a moment ago, Catrina, and it's really about labor market development in the context of the post-COVID world that we're looking at. And there's a lot of talk about a more resilient economy. There's a lot of talk, that we need to do a reopening, but we also need to think about a rebuilding. I mean, the Public Policy Forum is embarked on a Rebuild Canada project, which basically says that there's, two sets of issues that we need to think anew. One are issues that didn't exist before this happened. That might be, the size of public debt or how supply chain issues have arisen. And I think food security might be in that. It's not something we were as concerned with previously. And then other issues are ones where their trajectory has changed a fair bit. So the question is asking in the context of fisheries, agriculture, forestry, how the promotion of food security, particularly, and others, labor market, how that will affect labor market development, how the post-COVID world will affect labor market development and the Atlantic Pilot as you see it going forward.
I mean, so I'll be controversial and say not much. 3 potato farmers in New Brunswick can feed all the potatoes New Brunswickers can eat. And if you want to have a potato industry, you have to export. And so open borders, better quality assurance so that you can get through borders easy. It's true of fish, it's true of wheat, it's true of all those things. And again, you just have to think scale. I go to the market and buy fresh fruit every time I can and vegetables, but that's not going to keep an economy going. We need to export, and if it's just New Brunswick, there's almost 800,000 people. Well, not a lot of people can make money selling to that smaller market. And so there's some market realities. It's good, we should do what we can, but from an economic, you want to move the needle? Absolutely not.
Have you seen, Francis, so if when you say not much, I mean, is COVID-19 changing the profile and the markets for some industries?
Sure. You see more of that, and you see more delivery and local people doing things, and that's all very good. And a few people are making a little bit more money, et cetera. But it's not going to change the fundamentals for the potato farmer. If he doesn't, if they don't eat French fries in New York, they're going out of business, and then we lose that whole rural development side. So I get it. I'm sympathetic, but from an economic development point of view, it doesn't move the needle.
Right. Katrina, I'm going to give the last word to you, and you can go onto that question, or perhaps you just want to say, what do next steps look like from your perspective on what has been a successful program that now has, bumped into one of the most consequential and unexpected health and economic events of the past 100 years. So what do next steps look like to you in that context or outside that context?
I'm trying to think of a smooth way to bring up international students. So I'm just going to bring up international students because I think it's part of the path forward as well. So students are, international education is a $21 billion a year industry in Canada. And that, to state the obvious, is a big deal. So it's a big deal for Atlantic Canada. I note that you have David Dingwall, the president of the University of Cape Breton, coming up next to talk about this, but I'll just put in a couple of plugs. So this has been tough during this period. And so we put a number of facilitative measures in place in terms of how we still use the real attraction of a postgraduate work permit, which is a big Canada advantage on international education. So how we use that and still allow online or distance learning to take place. And so we're allowing this without any penalty to a post-graduation work permit to happen until January. We continue to evaluate and see what happens. We're working right now with provinces and territories, but with universities and colleges themselves about what's going to happen in September in terms of who's physically coming back to class, who's going to have distance learning, how we've got good protections in place to be able to protect the industry that we have. And then the second is, how do we continue to push Canada's advantage in this regard by staying open during this period, by putting other measures in place to be able to protect what's a pretty valuable and pretty important industry. And not just from a, it's good for everybody to have, foreign students at the University of Toronto, but the impact that has on the local economies of Wolfville, I'm a proud graduate of Acadia, but on Wolfville, on Sackville, on Sydney, on other places, that these are really important economic generators for those communities. And so that's another thing that we just want to watch pretty closely as we continue to work our way through this crisis, and to make sure that our steps are even and hit that balance between protecting health and security of Canadians and still really supporting a pretty critical industry for us. And I think that would be, it's the only thing I didn't mention, and I felt badly about it, especially because the president of the University of Cape Breton is next. And the other is just to watch really closely what's happening in the labor market and to be able to kind of adjust a little bit in real time on that. And that comes back to how we look both at a high-skilled model, which we continue to believe is really important, but also how we support regional labor market needs. And so we move from the Atlantic immigration pilot to the ones we're looking at with municipalities and with rural and northern. So there, I think that's how I'd finish.
Okay, well, look, that's a great note to end on, and a good segue actually to our next session. I want to thank you both. I want to thank you both for coming out, and well, actually, you probably didn't even leave your homes, but nonetheless, the spirit of coming out, and I think it's always good for the public service to have an opportunity to interact with with real people who are trying to cope with these issues too. And of course, this has been a historically important moment for public service, for public policy, for really attending to the public interest during a crisis. So I thank the public service through you for that great work, and on behalf of the audience as well. So thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.
And have a good rest of day.